The old Grayson factory loomed against the twilight sky, its silhouette a grim reminder of a dark past. Once a bustling hub of industry, the factory had been silent for decades, its machinery rusting and its walls crumbling. But tonight, lights flickered on for the first time in years, casting long shadows that danced ominously on the cracked pavement. James Marshall, the new foreman, stood at the entrance, surveying the massive structure. He was a practical man, more concerned with production quotas than ghost stories. As the new management sought to revitalize the factory, they hoped to bring jobs and prosperity back to the small town of Greystone. Yet, whispers of the factory's tragic history lingered among the townsfolk. James turned to the group of workers gathered behind him. "All right, everyone, let's get started. We have a lot of work to do to get this place up and running again." His voice echoed off the empty walls, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had filled the factory for so long. Among the workers was Sarah Thompson, a young single mother looking to make ends meet. She had heard the stories of the factory's dark past but dismissed them as old wives' tales. She needed this job, and no amount of ghostly lore would deter her. As the crew fanned out, dusting off machinery and clearing debris, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and she glanced around nervously. The factory seemed to breathe around them, the walls creaking and groaning as if in pain. "Sarah, over here," called Tom, one of the senior workers. He had found an old control panel covered in grime. "Help me get this cleaned up. We need to see if it's still functional." Grateful for the distraction, Sarah joined him, wiping away years of dust and dirt. As she worked, she noticed a faint set of initials carved into the wood. RJ. She paused, her fingers tracing the letters. A shiver ran down her spine. "Hey Tom, did you see this?" she asked, pointing to the initials. Tom glanced over and shrugged. "Probably just some old worker's mark. This place has seen a lot of people come and go." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The initials seemed almost fresh, as if they had been carved recently. She pushed the thought aside and focused on the task at hand. As night fell, the factory took on a more sinister appearance. The workers gathered their tools, preparing to leave for the day. James called out, "Good job, everyone. Let's call it a night. We'll pick up where we left off tomorrow." As they filed out, the factory seemed to exhale, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. But as the last worker stepped out and the doors closed behind them, a faint whisper echoed through the empty halls, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help us." Sarah paused, turning back towards the factory, but there was nothing to see. She shook her head, convincing herself it was just her imagination. Yet, as she walked to her car, she couldn't help but glance back at the looming structure, its dark windows staring back like vacant eyes. Little did she know the reopening of the Grayson factory had awakened something ancient and restless, something that had been waiting patiently in the shadows for decades. And now, with the living once again within its walls, the factory's tragic history was about to repeat itself. The following morning, the workers returned to the Grayson factory with a renewed sense of determination. The initial unease had been overshadowed by the need for progress. James Marshall had a tight schedule to meet, and the first shipments were due in less than a month. Sarah Thompson arrived early, hoping to shake off the lingering anxiety from the previous night. She made her way to the break room, a small, dingy space with a rickety table and a few mismatched chairs. As she sipped her coffee, she heard it again, a faint, distant whisper, just beyond the edge of hearing. She set down her cup and strained to listen, but the sound stopped. Sarah shook her head, chastising herself for being so jumpy. "Get it together, Sarah," she muttered, forcing herself to focus. The day proceeded as usual, the workers busy with their tasks. The factory was coming to life, machinery whirring and clanging. filling the air with a cacophony of industrial noise. Despite the activity, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere still lingered. Around midday, Tom approached Sarah with a puzzled look. "Hey, did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Sarah replied, her heart skipping a beat. "It sounded like someone whispering, but when I checked, there was no one there. Maybe it's just the wind or something," Tom said, rubbing the back of his neck. Sarah forced a smile. "Yeah, probably just the wind. This place is pretty drafty." But as the day went on, more workers reported hearing the same thing, faint whispers, indistinct but persistent, coming from the shadows. James dismissed the reports, attributing them to the creaky old building and the workers' overactive imaginations. However, by late afternoon, the whispers had grown louder, more insistent. Sarah was working near the back of the factory when she heard it again, this time unmistakable. Sarah. Sarah ... Her blood ran cold. The voice was clear, calling her name. She spun around, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the echo of her own voice bouncing off the walls. She backed away, her heart pounding. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. A shadow flitted across the far wall, disappearing into the darkness. Panicked, she hurried to find Tom. She found him near the control panel where they had worked the previous night. "Tom, I heard it again. It said my name," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Tom's face grew serious. "You're not the only one. Several of the guys have heard their names too. Something's not right here, Sarah." Before she could respond, the factory lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. The machinery groaned and whined, the noise reaching an unbearable pitch. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the factory into darkness. The workers froze, the air thick with tension. Then, out of the silence, the whispers returned, louder and more menacing. "Leave, leave, leave." Sarah clung to Tom, her heart racing. "What do we do?" she whispered. "We need to get out of here," Tom replied, his voice shaky. "Everyone head to the exits. Stay together." The workers stumbled through the dark, guided by the faint glow of emergency lights. As they made their way to the doors, Sarah felt a cold, invisible hand brush against her arm. She gasped, pulling away instinctively. "Did you feel that?" she asked Tom, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his face pale. "Let's just get out of here." They reached the doors and burst into the daylight, gasping for breath. The oppressive weight lifted, but the fear remained. James met them outside, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. "What the hell happened in there?" he demanded. Tom stepped forward. "We heard voices, whispers. The lights went out, and something touched us," he said, his voice wavering. James frowned. "This is ridiculous. There's no such thing as ghosts. It's just an old building with bad wiring." But Sarah knew it was more than that. The factory was alive with the spirits of the past, their restless whispers echoing through the halls, and she feared that this was only the beginning of their haunting. The factory's malfunctioning lights were quickly repaired, and the workers reluctantly returned to their tasks the next day. Although James dismissed the previous night's events as electrical issues, the unsettling whispers continued to haunt the workers' thoughts. Determined to meet the deadlines, James decided to stay late to oversee the repairs. Sarah and a few other workers volunteered to stay with him, driven by a mix of dedication and a shared sense of solidarity against the eerie happenings. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the factory's grimy windows, the atmosphere grew heavy once more. The whirring of machinery and the clanging of tools echoed in the cavernous space, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. Sarah was sorting through a pile of old equipment when she heard it again, a faint whisper, barely audible above the ambient noise. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly she turned, scanning the dimly lit room. "Sarah." This time the voice was clearer, unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw a figure at the far end of the room. It was a man, his clothes tattered and stained, his face pale and gaunt. He stood motionless, staring at her with hollow eyes. "Tom?" she called out, her voice quivering. "Tom, come here, quickly!" Tom rushed over, his expression concerned. "What is it, Sarah?" She pointed to where the figure had been, but it was gone. "There was someone there. I saw him. He called my name." Tom frowned, peering into the shadows. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just a trick of the light." "No, it was real," she insisted, her voice trembling. "I know what I saw." Before Tom could respond, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the overhead lights. The darkness was immediate and suffocating, broken only by the faint glow of their flashlights. The whispers returned, louder this time, a chorus of mournful voices blending together. "Help us. Find us." The workers huddled together, their fear palpable. James's voice cut through the darkness, firm but tinged with unease. "Everyone stay calm. Let's find the breaker and get the lights back on." As they made their way through the factory, the whispers grew more frantic, echoing off the walls. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, her flashlight flickering as if affected by some unseen force. They reached the breaker room, and James quickly restored the power. The lights flickered back to life, casting harsh, artificial light over the scene. The whispers ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. "All right, that's enough for tonight," James said, his voice strained. "Everyone head home. We'll resume work tomorrow." The workers hurried to gather their things, eager to leave the haunted factory behind. As Sarah made her way to the exit, she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. There, standing just a few feet away, was the same ghostly figure. His eyes bore into hers, filled with a desperate plea. "Find us," he whispered, his voice a mere breath of sound. "Set us free." Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing. The figure vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving her shaken and terrified. Outside, the workers exchanged uneasy glances, their shared fear unspoken but understood. Tom approached Sarah, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "I saw him again, Tom. He spoke to me. He wants us to find them." Tom's expression grew grave. "We need to figure out what's going on here. This isn't just electrical problems or old building noises. There's something, or someone, in that factory." James overheard their conversation and approached, his stern facade cracking. "I don't know what's happening here, but we're going to get to the bottom of it. Tomorrow we'll start looking into the factory's past. Maybe there's something we've missed." As they drove away from the factory, the oppressive weight lifted, but a sense of dread lingered. Sarah knew they were dealing with something beyond the realm of the living, and the haunting was far from over. The ghostly figure's plea echoed in her mind. "Find us. Set us free." The spirits trapped in the Grayson factory were reaching out, desperate for release, and Sarah was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The next morning, Sarah and Tom met at the local library, determined to uncover the dark history of the Grayson factory. The building's ominous presence seemed even more daunting in the harsh light of day, but they were resolute in their quest for answers. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Whitaker, greeted them warmly. "What brings you two here so early?" she asked, her keen eyes peering over the rim of her glasses. "We're looking for information on the Grayson factory," Tom explained. particularly about any accidents or incidents that might have happened there. Mrs. Whitaker's expression turned somber. "Ah, the old factory, a place with a dark past indeed. Follow me." She led them to a dusty archive room filled with old newspapers, town records, and photographs. The factory was the town's lifeline once, but that all changed after the accident, she said, pulling out a large yellowed ledger. "Here, these should help you." Sarah and Tom pored over the records, piecing together the tragic history of the factory. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for, a newspaper clipping dated April 13th, 1952, with the headline, "Disaster at Grayson Factory, Dozens Feared Dead." Sarah read aloud, her voice trembling. "A catastrophic boiler explosion at the Grayson factory has resulted in numerous casualties. The exact number of deaths is still unknown, as many bodies remain unrecovered. The factory has been shut down indefinitely following the tragedy." Tom frowned, his brow furrowing. Unrecovered bodies? No wonder the spirits are restless. They're trapped there, unable to move on. They continued digging, uncovering more articles and documents. The victims' names and stories emerged. Men and women who had worked tirelessly to support their families, only to meet a horrific end. Among the names, Sarah found one that sent a chill down her spine. Robert Jenkins, the initials RJ carved into the control panel. "Robert Jenkins was the foreman at the time of the accident," she said, showing the article to Tom. "He was well respected and loved by his crew. They say he stayed behind to try and save as many people as he could." Tom nodded, his face grim. "And now he's reaching out to us. We need to find a way to lay them to rest." Mrs. Whitaker approached with another document. "This might interest you," she said, handing them a faded map of the factory. "It shows the layout before the accident, including the location of the boiler room and other key areas." Sarah traced her finger over the map, noting the boiler room's position deep within the factory. "We need to go back there," she said, steeling herself. "We need to find their remains and give them a proper burial." Tom agreed, though the prospect filled him with dread. "We should gather the others and tell them what we've found. We'll need all the help we can get." They thanked Mrs. Whitaker and headed back to the factory, the weight of their discovery pressing heavily upon them. The other workers were already there, preparing to resume their tasks. James stood among them, his expression a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Did you find anything?" he asked. Sarah nodded, holding up the articles and map. "The factory suffered a terrible accident in 1952. Many workers died, and their bodies were never recovered. We believe their spirits are trapped here, and they're trying to communicate with us." James's face paled slightly, but he remained resolute. "All right, what do we need to do?" "We need to find the remains and give them a proper burial," Tom said. "We think they might be near the boiler room where the explosion happened." The workers exchanged uneasy glances but nodded in agreement. They were a close-knit group, and the events of the past few days had only strengthened their bond. As they made their way deeper into the factory, the air grew colder, and the oppressive atmosphere returned. The whispers started again, guiding them towards the boiler room. "Help us. Find us." When they reached the room, the sight that greeted them was haunting. The once mighty boiler was a twisted, rusted mass of metal, surrounded by debris and scorch marks. Sarah's flashlight beam caught a glint of something half buried in the rubble, an old, tarnished locket. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. "This must have belonged to one of the workers," she whispered, opening the locket to reveal a faded photograph of a young woman and a child. Tom knelt beside her, examining the area. "We need to clear this rubble. Their remains are likely buried here." As they began to dig, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The spirits were close, their restless energy palpable, and as the workers unearthed the bones of the past, they knew they were on the brink of something momentous, something that would finally bring peace to the haunted halls of the Grayson factory. The uncovering of the bones brought a temporary, eerie calm to the factory. It seemed that the spirits were momentarily appeased, but the tranquility did not last long. The next day, as the workers arrived and resumed their tasks, the hauntings grew more frequent and intense. Sarah was in the break room when it started. She was pouring herself a cup of coffee when she noticed a figure reflected in the window. Turning around, she found the room empty. Her heart pounded as she approached the window, the cold air from outside seeping through the glass. The whispers began again, louder and clearer than before. "Find us. Remember us." Back on the factory floor, Tom was checking the machinery when he saw a ghostly figure out of the corner of his eye. It was a man, his face pale and eyes hollow, dressed in the outdated work clothes of the 1950s. The spirit was performing the same motions as Tom, as if trapped in an endless loop of its final moments. Tom's breath caught in his throat. "Do you see that?" he asked one of his colleagues, but the figure vanished before anyone else could witness it. As the day wore on, more workers reported sightings. Apparitions of the dead walked the halls, their faces twisted in expressions of pain and sorrow. The ghosts seemed drawn to the machinery, as if trying to finish the tasks they had left behind. The factory had become a place where the past and present intertwined, each shift a surreal blend of reality and ghostly reenactment. James called a meeting, his usual stern demeanor replaced by genuine concern. "We can't ignore this any longer," he said. "These spirits are trying to communicate with us. We need to figure out what they want." One of the senior workers, a man named Bill, spoke up. "I've seen them too, James. They're just trying to do their jobs, like they never left. Maybe they need closure, a way to move on." The workers discussed various theories, but all agreed that the factory's tragic history was the key to understanding the hauntings. Sarah suggested they bring in a medium to help communicate with the spirits. The next day they contacted Madame Lavinia, a renowned medium known for her ability to connect with the other side. She arrived at the factory, her presence bringing a mixture of hope and fear. Madame Lavinia, a tall woman with an air of mystery, set up her candles and incense in the center of the factory floor. The workers gathered around, their faces a mix of skepticism and curiosity. She began the seance, her voice low and melodic, calling out to the spirits. "We are here to help you. Please, show us what you need." The air grew colder, the flickering candle flames casting eerie shadows. The whispers intensified, and then, one by one, the ghostly figures appeared. They surrounded the circle, their faces filled with sorrow and longing. One spirit stepped forward. It was Robert Jenkins, the foreman from the fatal accident. His form was clearer, more solid than the others. "We need to be remembered," he said, his voice echoing through the factory. "Our stories must be told. Our families need to know the truth." Madame Lavinia nodded. "We will help you. Tell us what we need to do." Robert's spirit pointed towards the rubble near the old boiler room. "There are records, letters, and personal items buried there. They hold our stories. Find them, and you will find peace for us." The seance ended, leaving the workers with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew what they had to do: uncover the buried items and share the stories of the lost souls. The next day, they returned to the boiler room, armed with shovels and determination. As they dug, they uncovered a rusted metal box. Inside, they found old letters, photographs, and personal belongings. Each item told a story of the lives that had been cut short by the tragedy. Sarah held up a letter, the paper yellowed and fragile. It was a love letter from Robert Jenkins to his wife, filled with promises and dreams for a future that never came. Tears filled her eyes as she read it aloud to the group. As they unearthed more items, the apparitions became less frequent, their forms fading into the ether. The spirits were finally finding peace, their stories acknowledged and remembered. That night, the factory was quiet. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a solemn tranquility. Sarah, Tom, and the other workers gathered outside, feeling a sense of accomplishment and closure. James addressed the group, his voice filled with emotion. "We've done something important here. We've given these souls a chance to rest. Thank you all for your hard work and dedication." As they stood there, the last light of day fading, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Robert Jenkins, his spirit looking more at peace than before. He nodded in gratitude before fading into the night. The Grayson factory had been a place of tragedy, but now it stood as a testament to the power of remembrance and the importance of honoring those who came before. And as the workers went their separate ways, they knew they had been part of something truly extraordinary. The peace was short-lived. Despite uncovering and honoring the buried items, the factory's atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The apparitions became less frequent, but their presence lingered, replaced by something more sinister. Possessions. It began with small, inexplicable actions. Workers found themselves forgetting tasks they had just completed or becoming inexplicably drawn to specific areas of the factory. Sarah noticed it first when she caught herself humming an old tune she didn't recognize while operating the machinery. One morning, James called a meeting in the break room. He looked more haggard than usual, dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. "We've got a problem," he began, his voice strained. "People are acting strange. I've seen workers wandering aimlessly, repeating the same actions over and over." Sarah exchanged worried glances with Tom. "I've noticed it too," she admitted. "It's like they're in a trance, and it's getting worse." Bill, the senior worker, stood up, his face pale and drawn. I think I've been affected," he said, his voice shaking. "Yesterday, I found myself in the old boiler room, standing there for hours. I don't even remember going there." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. James clenched his fists, struggling to maintain control. "We need to figure out what's causing this before someone gets seriously hurt." The factory's atmosphere grew more oppressive with each passing day. Workers reported vivid nightmares, waking in cold sweats with no memory of their dreams. Some began to hear voices in their heads, a constant murmur that grew louder with each passing hour. One afternoon, Sarah was working near the old boiler room when she saw Tom standing motionless, his eyes glazed over. She approached him cautiously, calling his name. "Tom? Are you okay?" He didn't respond. His lips moved silently as if reciting something. Sarah reached out, shaking his shoulder gently. "Tom, snap out of it." Tom blinked, his eyes focusing on her. He looked confused and disoriented. "Sarah? What happened?" "You were just standing there, muttering to yourself," she said, her voice tinged with fear. "Do you remember anything?" He shook his head, rubbing his temples. "No, it's like a fog. I can't remember." The incidents continued to escalate. Workers began to experience violent outbursts, lashing out at unseen forces. Machinery malfunctioned, leading to near-fatal accidents that mirrored the original tragedy. The factory seemed to be alive with a malevolent force, feeding on the workers' fear and confusion. James called in Madame Lavinia once more, desperate for a solution. She arrived at the factory, her face grim as she sensed the dark energy within. "The spirits are not at rest," she said. "Something is binding them here, something more powerful than their memories." She led another séance, this time in the heart of the factory. The workers gathered around, their fear palpable. As Madame Lavinia began to chant, the temperature dropped and the lights flickered. The ghostly figures appeared again, their faces twisted in anguish. Robert Jenkins stepped forward, his eyes filled with sorrow. "We are trapped," he said, his voice a mournful wail. "The factory holds us here, our pain and suffering feeding its darkness." Madame Lavinia's eyes widened. "The factory itself is a conduit, a vessel for the negative energy created by the tragedy. To free the spirits, we must cleanse the factory." She explained the ritual needed, a combination of purifying the space and honoring the spirits one last time. It involved burning sage, placing protective symbols around the factory, and reciting a powerful incantation to break the binding force. The workers set to work, their fear overshadowed by determination. They followed Madame Lavinia's instructions meticulously, hoping to finally bring peace to the haunted factory. As they performed the ritual, the factory reacted violently. The walls shook, and the whispers became deafening. Machinery rattled and groaned as if resisting their efforts, but they pressed on, reciting the incantation with fervor. At the climax of the ritual, a brilliant light filled the factory, illuminating the ghostly figures. The spirits cried out, their forms dissipating into the light. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of calm and tranquility. When the light faded, the factory was silent. The workers looked around, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Madame Lavinia smiled, her eyes shining with satisfaction. "The spirits are free. The factory is cleansed." Sarah and Tom embraced, tears streaming down their faces. "We did it," Sarah whispered. "They're finally at peace." As they left the factory, the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the building. The Grayson factory stood as a testament to the power of remembrance and the strength of the human spirit. The haunting was over, but the memory of those who had suffered would live on, honored and never forgotten. The initial relief from the successful ritual was short-lived. Within a few days, strange occurrences resumed at the Grayson factory. This time, the disturbances were more intense, as if the spirits were fighting back against their attempted release. Objects moved on their own, eerie shadows flitted across walls, and an overwhelming sense of dread pervaded every corner of the factory. James, desperate to end the torment, called an emergency meeting with the workers. They gathered in the break room, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Madame Lavinia's ritual didn't work, James admitted, his voice strained. "We need another plan. Does anyone have any ideas?" Tom spoke up, his voice filled with resolve. "We need to contact the families of the victims. The spirits said they wanted their stories to be known. Maybe if we bring their families here, they can help put them to rest." Sarah nodded. "It's worth a try. The families might have personal items or memories that can help us understand what the spirits need." James agreed, and the workers set out to track down the families of the deceased. They combed through old records, visited town archives, and reached out to the community. Slowly, they began to piece together the lives of those who had perished in the factory accident. A week later, the families began to arrive. The factory's atmosphere grew even more charged with emotion as loved ones gathered to honor the memories of those who had died. Among them was Evelyn Jenkins, the granddaughter of Robert Jenkins. She held an old photograph of her grandfather, tears welling in her eyes. "My grandmother always spoke of him as a hero," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "She never truly got over his death. Maybe now we can finally give him the peace he deserves." The families gathered in the factory, each bringing personal items, letters, photographs, and cherished mementos. They placed these items in a makeshift shrine in the old boiler room, the site of the tragic accident. Madame Lavinia returned to lead a final, more powerful ritual. The workers and families stood in a circle, holding hands as she chanted incantations and burned sage. The air grew thick with anticipation, the tension almost unbearable. As the ritual reached its climax, the spirits appeared once more. This time their forms were clearer, their faces more serene. Robert Jenkins stepped forward, his eyes meeting Evelyn's. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've given us what we needed, a connection to our past and the love we left behind." Evelyn stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Grandpa, I hope you can finally rest now. We love you, and we will never forget you." The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The factory seemed to exhale, releasing decades of pain and suffering. James stepped forward, his voice choked with emotion. "It's over. They're finally at peace." The workers and families embraced, their shared relief palpable. They knew they had been part of something extraordinary, something that had brought closure and healing to both the living and the dead. The factory, once a place of tragedy, now stood as a testament to the power of love and remembrance. The haunting was over, and the spirits had found their final resting place. The workers and families left the factory, their hearts lighter, knowing they had helped to end the suffering of those who had been trapped for so long. As Sarah walked away, she felt a gentle breeze brush against her cheek, as if a final farewell from the spirits. She smiled, knowing that they were finally free. But as the factory stood silent in the fading light, a new whisper echoed through its empty halls, a whisper of stories yet to be told and secrets still buried. The Grayson factory would never be the same, but it had found a new purpose, a place where the past and present intertwined, a place of memory and peace. Despite the family's visit and Madame Lavinia's powerful ritual, the tranquility did not last. The next day, the factory returned to its eerie state, with a heightened sense of malevolence. The whispers grew louder, and the apparitions became more frequent, their faces twisted in anguish. The sense of unfinished business weighed heavily on everyone. James, Sarah, and Tom gathered in the break room, their spirits dampened by the relentless haunting. "We've tried everything," James said, his voice heavy with frustration. "What more do these spirits want?" Sarah, her eyes filled with determination, said, "There must be something we've missed, something more profound that's anchoring them here. We need to dig deeper." Madame Lavinia, sensing their distress, had stayed behind. She approached them with a grave expression. "Sometimes the restless dead require more than rituals and remembrance. Sometimes a sacrifice is needed, an offering of life or something equally significant to sever their ties to this world." The workers fell silent, absorbing the weight of her words. James broke the silence. "We can't ask anyone to sacrifice themselves. There has to be another way." Madame Lavinia nodded. "Not all sacrifices require death. Sometimes it's a matter of giving up something deeply cherished or confronting the darkest secrets that bind the spirits." Sarah's thoughts turned to the factory's history. The bodies were never properly buried, and their spirits seemed tied to the machinery and the accident site. What if the real sacrifice is to face the full truth of what happened and ensure their remains are given a proper, dignified burial? Tom agreed. "We need to find the exact locations of their remains and give them the respect they deserve. We have to dig deeper, literally and figuratively." The workers, along with Madame Lavinia, began a meticulous search of the factory grounds, guided by old maps and records. Days turned into nights as they sifted through debris and rubble, uncovering more bones and personal items. Each discovery felt like a step closer to understanding the depth of the tragedy. In the depths of the factory, near the old boiler room, they found a sealed-off section that had been hidden for decades. With great effort, they pried it open, revealing a gruesome sight. Remains of workers trapped and forgotten, their tools and belongings scattered around them. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she picked up an old, rusted locket. These people were left here to die, abandoned. Their spirits can't rest until their remains are honored and their story fully told. As they prepared the site for a proper burial, Madame Lavinia suggested one final ritual, a profound act of remembrance and release. We must gather the families again, and this time, we must tell the complete story. No secrets, no omissions. Only then can we offer the spirits the peace they seek. The families were contacted and returned to the factory, each bringing personal mementos and stories. The atmosphere was charged with emotion as they gathered near the uncovered remains. Madame Lavinia led them in a final solemn ceremony, each family member speaking words of love and farewell. As the ritual progressed, the air grew colder, and the spirits appeared once more, their forms clearer and more serene. Robert Jenkins stepped forward, his eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you for remembering us," he said, "but there is one more thing needed for us to rest. Someone must take on the burden of our pain, to share our suffering and release it." Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. "I'll take on your pain and suffering. Just tell me what to do." Madame Lavinia guided Sarah through the process, a deeply personal ritual of empathy and connection. Sarah felt the weight of their suffering, the horror of their final moments, and the anguish of being forgotten. Tears streamed down her face as she absorbed their pain, offering them her strength and compassion. As the ritual reached its climax, the spirits began to fade, their faces filled with peace. Robert Jenkins smiled at Sarah, his form dissolving into light. "Thank you," he whispered. "You have set us free." The factory grew silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. The workers and families embraced, their shared relief palpable. The spirits were finally at peace, their stories told, their remains honored. Sarah, exhausted but triumphant, felt a sense of profound connection to the spirit she had helped release. She knew that she had made a true sacrifice, not of life, but of empathy and understanding. The Grayson factory stood as a place of memory and healing, a testament to the power of remembrance and the courage to face the darkest truths. The haunting was over, but the lessons learned would resonate for generations to come. With the spirits seemingly at peace, the factory returned to a semblance of normalcy. The workers, families, and townspeople gathered one last time to lay the remains to rest properly. A quiet, solemn ceremony was planned, held on a cool, clear morning. Sarah, Tom, James, and Madame Lavinia stood by as the workers carefully placed the uncovered bones into individual caskets. The families had written letters and gathered personal items to include with the remains, ensuring that each spirit was remembered and honored. The ceremony took place in a serene corner of the factory grounds, transformed into a makeshift memorial garden. Flowers were planted, and a plaque was erected with the names of all those who had perished in the accident. The town's priest, Father O'Reilly, led the service, his voice steady and comforting. "We are here to honor the lives lost in the Grayson factory tragedy," he began, "to acknowledge their suffering and to give them the peace they deserve. May they rest in eternal light, free from the pain and sorrow that bound them here." One by one, the families stepped forward, sharing memories and placing their offerings into the graves. Evelyn Jenkins spoke of her grandfather's bravery and dedication, her voice breaking as she placed a locket into his casket. As the last casket was lowered into the ground, Sarah stepped forward, carrying the locket she had found in the rubble. "This belonged to one of the workers," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's a symbol of their love, their life, and their legacy. May it bring them peace." She placed the locket in the final grave and stepped back, her heart heavy, yet hopeful. Father O'Reilly concluded the ceremony with a prayer, and the workers began to cover the graves with earth. The sound of shovels filled the air, a poignant reminder of the finality and necessity of the act. As the graves were filled, a profound sense of peace settled over the factory grounds. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted entirely, replaced by a feeling of closure and tranquility. The families lingered, sharing stories and comforting one another, the bonds of community strengthened by their shared experience. Sarah, Tom, James, and Madame Lavinia stood together, watching as the families slowly began to disperse. "We did it," Tom said, his voice filled with relief. "We finally gave them the rest they deserve." James nodded, his stern facade softened by the weight of the moment. "This factory will never be the same, but it's not a place of fear anymore. It's a place of remembrance." Madame Lavinia smiled, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "You all showed great courage and compassion. The spirits are at peace because of your efforts." Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment and closure, but also a lingering sadness for the lives lost. "It's hard to believe it's really over," she said, "but I'm glad we could help them." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the memorial garden, the workers gathered one last time. They shared a meal, laughter, and stories, celebrating their victory over the darkness that had plagued the factory for so long. Sarah and Tom stood apart from the group, watching the sunset. "What do you think will happen now?" Tom asked, his voice contemplative. Sarah shrugged, a smile playing on her lips. "I think the factory will continue, but with a new purpose. We'll remember the past, honor it, and move forward. It's a place of healing now for the living and the dead." Tom nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I think you're right, and we'll make sure their stories are never forgotten." As the night fell and the stars emerged, the Grayson factory stood silent and serene, a place of peace and remembrance. The spirits had found their final resting place, their stories told and honored, and the living had found a renewed sense of purpose and connection, forever changed by the experience. The haunting was over, but the legacy of the Grayson factory would live on, a testament to the power of compassion, remembrance, and the unbreakable bond between the past and the present.